The airport was alive with the rhythmic hum of bustling travelers. Their hurried footsteps and rolling suitcases blending into a constant, soft roar. John Edwards, his weathered hand gripping the handle of a worn leather suitcase, made his way through the terminal. Atop his head, a faded military cap rested proudly, the embroidered insignia faint from decades of wear but gleaming with history. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though the weight of his years echoed in every movement. John was an 88-year-old veteran. But even more than that, he was a keeper of memories, a bearer of stories most would never hear, a living testament to a lifetime of service. He had traveled here alone. The national tribute to World War II veterans had called him, reminding him of faces and voices long lost to time. Standing beside his fellow soldiers, the dwindling few who had made it to the event, he had felt pride and loss in equal measure. Yet, as moving as it was to see that his generation's sacrifices were remembered, the event had cast a shadow as well, a reminder of just how few remained. As he shuffled through the terminal, those faces, young and strong as they had been in their prime, flickered across his mind. Each one a cherished friend who had not lived to see this moment. Years had passed since John had last been greeted with salutes, with the weight of a uniform on his shoulders. In his quiet life now, his service was rarely spoken of, and his memories lay mostly untouched. His family, though loving, was scattered, his children far away. His beloved Margaret gone 5 years now. This trip was his own pilgrimage, a journey to honor those who couldn't make it, a silent vow he had made to himself. A warm, steady voice broke through his thoughts as he reached the check-in counter. A young airline employee with kind eyes greeted him, her expression shifting as she noticed his cap. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice gentle, respectful. "May I see your ticket, please?" John fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled boarding pass, and handed it to her. As she glanced at it, her eyebrows rose slightly, and she looked back at him with a glimmer of surprise and admiration. "Mr. Edwards," she said, her tone tinged with a soft reverence. "You've been upgraded to first class. It's a gesture from the airline to thank you for your service." A mix of confusion and humility passed over John's face. "First class," he repeated, his voice as rough as the years that had worn it. I didn't ask for anything special. I bought an economy ticket." The young woman's smile softened further. "Yes, sir. But we wanted to honor you in this small way. It's the least we can do." Her words stirred something deep in John's heart, a forgotten pride, a touch of gratitude mingling with disbelief. For years, he'd told himself he hadn't served for recognition. And he meant it. But this acknowledgement, unexpected and gentle, reached into a part of him that had felt unnoticed for so long. He blinked rapidly, swallowing against the lump rising in his throat. That's very kind of you," he managed, his voice thick, barely holding back the emotion behind his words. "But really, I don't need this. I didn't serve for rewards." The young woman leaned forward, her hand resting briefly on his across the counter. "We know, Mr. Edwards. But please, let us do this. You've more than earned it." With a nod of thanks and a slightly trembling hand, John accepted the new boarding pass and moved on, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't fully understand. As he walked toward security, he realized it wasn't just the upgrade that weighed on him, it was the sense of connection. The small reminder that someone, somewhere, remembered the sacrifices of men like him. As John walked toward the gate, his thoughts drifted. He couldn't shake the unexpected kindness from the airline, the young woman's gentle voice still echoing in his mind. First class, he thought, rolling the words around in his head like a foreign phrase. Luxury was something he'd rarely known. A world far removed from his life in Nebraska. From the quiet, steady years on the farm. The life of routines and simplicity he and Margaret had built together. Even now, the thought of stretching out in a seat meant for businessmen and dignitaries filled him with an odd mixture of gratitude and discomfort. When he reached the security checkpoint, a fresh set of challenges awaited. John's arthritic fingers struggled with his belt buckle, his shoes, his jacket, all the small tasks that were easy once but now felt like small battles in their own right. He managed to remove his shoes with difficulty, standing on one foot for balance as he slowly slipped the other shoe off, feeling his knee creak in protest. Just as he bent down to pick up his shoes, a TSA agent, noticing his veteran's cap, approached with a gentle smile. "Need a hand, sir?" the young man asked, kneeling to help John retie his shoes after he passed through the metal detector. "My grandpa was in the Navy," he added as he worked, glancing up at John. "He always said the real heroes were the guys on the ground." John chuckled, the sound warm but distant. We all did our part, he replied. His voice steady, though his mind had drifted back to a different time. To fields of smoke and fear. On land, sea, or in the air. We were just kids doing what needed to be done. The young agent's words stirred something within him. A shared understanding that felt almost sacred. Like a quiet acknowledgement of a bond that crossed generations. With a nod of thanks, John continued toward his gate. The echoes of long-gone voices whispering in his mind. Their laughter and shouts threading through his thoughts. He found himself lost in memories. Drifting through the decades back to a time when he was just a young man. Wide-eyed and hopeful. Thrust into a world torn by conflict. The gate area was crowded. Filled with travelers glancing at screens. Checking the time. And making last-minute calls. First-class passengers and those needing extra assistance. Please board now, the gate agent announced over the loudspeaker. John hesitated. His instinct telling him to wait. To stand back until others had boarded. But a gentle hand on his elbow guided him forward. This way. Sir, a flight attendant said with a kind smile. She led him toward the plane. Her pace matching his slower steps with patience. As John entered the aircraft. The differences were immediate. The first-class cabin opened before him like a hidden world, a spacious, quiet place where plush leather seats replaced the cramped rows he was used to. The attendant led him to his seat. A wide, window-side chair with ample legroom. Can I help you with your bag? Sir, she asked. Her voice warm. John shook his head. No thank you. I'll manage, he replied, clutching his small suitcase a bit tighter. Inside, he carried two things that he preferred to keep close, his carefully folded dress uniform and a small photo album. Each page a window to a past he cherished. Filled with faces and places that no longer existed outside his memory. As he settled into the soft leather seat, John looked around. Feeling a pang of discomfort. The other passengers filed in one by one. Dressed in business suits and designer clothes. Their crisp perfumes and colognes mingling in the air. John glanced down at his own worn slacks and button-up shirt. Feeling oddly out of place. As if he were an uninvited guest in someone else's home. Across the aisle. A well-dressed man gave him a curious look. His eyes landing on John's veteran's cap. For a moment, John thought the man might speak. But he simply nodded in acknowledgement before returning to his smartphone. Absorbed in a world of screens and instant messages, John turned his gaze to the window, watching the ground crew below as they moved in orchestrated precision around the plane. He remembered the airfields of Europe. The constant hum of engines. The acrid smell of fuel. And the rush of young men preparing for flight. How different this was. He thought, so orderly. So calm. As the last of the first-class passengers settled into their seats, John closed his eyes, allowing the soft murmur of voices to wash over him. He was tired. A kind of tiredness that reached beyond the day's journey and into the years. The weight of memories pressing down on him like an old coat. The tribute ceremony had left him with a swirl of emotions, joy at seeing old friends. Sorrow for those who weren't there. And a bittersweet pride in the legacy they'd all left behind. But as he sat in this plush seat, a world away from the dusty fields and smoky skies he remembered. He couldn't shake a certain feeling, a quiet sense of unease. A reminder that, for all the years that had passed, he was still a simple man. A farm boy from Nebraska who had never thought he'd see such luxuries. Yet here he was. A guest in a realm he'd never belonged to. An old soldier carrying the weight of his past into an unknown journey. John sat quietly. His hands resting on his veteran's cap. The soft leather of the seat feeling foreign against the worn fabric of his trousers. He gazed out the window. The buzz of airport activity below reminding him of long-forgotten days of airfields and rushes to the tarmac. The roar of the engines. The shouts of young men scrambling into action. Now these memories felt almost like another life. Here, in the cocoon of first class, surrounded by people he'd never thought he'd sit beside, John felt like an outsider. A man of another era thrust into a world he didn't quite belong to. The pre-flight boarding announcements buzzed softly through the speakers. And a few last passengers trickled down the aisle. Their footsteps soft on the plush carpeting. Then came the distinct click-clack of high heels. John glanced up, and his eyes met a woman striding briskly down the aisle. Her designer handbag swinging at her side. The sharp edges of her tailored suit cutting a commanding silhouette. Her face was poised. Her hair meticulously arranged. And her eyes were fixed on her phone. Fingers tapping furiously across the screen. As she approached his row, John's instinct was to shift slightly to give her space. But she barely glanced up. She moved into the aisle seat next to him. Her movements sharp and hurried. The scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her. Her handbag brushed against John's arm. And he flinched slightly at the unexpected contact. A reflex born from years of respect for personal space. The woman finally looked up, and her gaze landed on John, her eyes sweeping from his face down to his modest clothes, then resting on the worn cap in his lap. Her expression shifted, her polished brow creasing, a hint of irritation in her perfectly lined eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice crisp and slightly clipped. "I think you might be in the wrong section. This is first class." John blinked, momentarily stunned. He lifted his boarding pass, glancing down at it before looking back at her. "No ma'am," he replied gently, his voice calm but firm. "This is my seat, 2A. Right here." The woman's frown deepened. She didn't take her seat. Instead, she crossed her arms, shifting her weight, and her tone turned sharper. "There must be some mistake. This section is for people who paid for it. Economy class is further back." Heat crept up John's neck, a flush of embarrassment. He was aware of the other passengers around them, the sideways glances and a few murmurs as people began to notice the exchange. He met her gaze, his voice steady as he spoke. "I understand your confusion," he said softly, "but the airline upgraded me. It's a gesture of appreciation for my service." "Upgraded," she repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. "I find that hard to believe. I'm a frequent flyer. And they don't just hand out first-class seats to," her eyes flicked over him, from his well-worn shirt to his cap, "to just anyone." The implication hung heavy between them, her words laced with disbelief and disdain. John's chest tightened. The familiar ache of being judged, of being dismissed based on appearances alone. It was a feeling he hadn't encountered in years, and he was shocked by how deeply it stung. How quickly it resurfaced memories of prejudice he'd thought long buried. "Ma'am," he began, his voice firm but respectful, "I assure you, I have every right to be here. The airline offered me this seat as a token of appreciation for my military service." He held out his boarding pass, the words "first class" clearly printed. But the woman barely glanced at it. Her expression remained steely, her face flushed with embarrassment and barely concealed anger. "Military service?" she scoffed, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "That hardly seems a reason to displace paying customers. Surely you understand how highly irregular this is." The quiet murmurs around them grew louder. John could feel the weight of stares from every corner of the cabin, each passenger taking in the exchange. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his gaze shifting between John and the woman, his expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice gentle, but concerned. Before John could respond, the woman turned to the man, her voice brimming with indignation. "No, it's not all right," she snapped. "This gentleman," she almost spat the word, her tone laced with doubt, "claims he's been given a first-class seat because of some supposed military service. I fly frequently, and I've never heard of such a policy. He's clearly trying to get something for free." The flush on John's face deepened, a mixture of shame and frustration roiling within him. He had faced far worse than this: enemy fire, losing friends on foreign soil, the grueling years of rebuilding a fractured world. And yet here he was, being accused of duplicity by someone who couldn't see past his appearance, who couldn't begin to comprehend the sacrifices he and his fellow soldiers had made. "Ma'am," John said quietly, his voice low but unwavering, "I fought for this country. I've seen things you couldn't imagine. I'm not trying to get anything for free. I'm simply accepting a kindness that was offered to me, something I've rarely asked for in all my years." For a fleeting moment, the woman's expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But just as quickly, her features hardened again, her indignation rising. "Well," she huffed, "I still think this is highly inappropriate. I'm going to speak to the flight attendant about this." As if on cue, a flight attendant appeared at the end of their row, her youthful face calm but tinged with concern as she took in the tension between them. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. The woman immediately launched into her complaint, gesturing toward John as she spoke. "Yes, there is a problem. This man claims he's been given a first-class seat due to military service. I fly frequently, and I've never heard of such a policy. I think there's been a mistake, and I'd like it rectified immediately." The flight attendant listened patiently, her gaze moving between the woman and John, who sat silently, his hands gripping his cap a little tighter than before. When the woman finished, the attendant turned to John with a gentle smile. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Wordlessly, John handed it over, feeling a swell of relief as she examined it, her eyes softening as she looked back at him. "Everything is in order, sir," she said warmly. "You're in the correct seat." It's our airline's policy to upgrade veterans when possible as a small token of our gratitude for their service. Turning back to the woman. Her voice remained professional, but a slight firmness had entered her tone. Ma'am, Mr. Edwards is correctly assigned to this seat. I'm going to have to ask you to please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff. The woman's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth as if to argue further, but after a moment, she snapped it shut. Exhaling sharply. With a huff, she stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and took her seat, turning pointedly away from John. As the flight attendant moved away, a heavy silence settled over the row, the hum of the plane's engines filling the space between them. John felt the weight of the other passengers' stares, a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. He wished, for a brief moment, that he could disappear, to slip into the leather seat and fade from sight. This was supposed to be a simple journey home, a quiet end to an emotional trip. Instead, it had become a public spectacle, a humiliation that reminded him of the times when his sacrifices had gone unseen, unacknowledged. And yet, as the initial shock began to fade, another feeling stirred within him, not anger, though he had every right to feel it, nor resentment toward the woman who had so quickly judged him. Instead, he felt a profound sadness, a deep ache for a world where, after all these years, appearances still mattered more than character. The quiet hum of the aircraft filled the first-class cabin, but John's mind was far from calm. As he sat in silence, his fingers traced the edges of his worn veteran's cap. The sting of the woman's words lingered, an echo of long-buried memories and forgotten slights. She hadn't known him, of course, didn't know what he had seen or sacrificed. Yet her harsh judgment had struck him with a force he hadn't expected. Leaning back in his seat, he closed his eyes and tried to let the tension drain from his body. But with every attempt at calm, his thoughts pulled him back, further into the past, to other moments when people had looked at him and seen only a uniform or, sometimes, only the scars he bore from battles fought and comrades lost. The hurt was deep and layered. It wasn't just the pain of one woman's rude dismissal, but a lifetime of experiences in which others had questioned his worth, his place in the world. Slowly, the initial anger faded, replaced by a sense of profound sadness. He thought of Margaret, his late wife, and how she had always managed to put words to his feelings when he couldn't. She would have known exactly what to say in this moment. Her steady hand on his shoulder, her voice a soothing balm. She had been his anchor, his steady place in a world that so often felt chaotic. Her absence felt especially heavy now, and he found himself wishing he could hear her words, feel her comforting presence guiding him through this painful encounter. A flight attendant approached, offering drinks. John asked for water, his voice barely above a whisper. Beside him, the woman ordered a glass of white wine, her tone still clipped and brisk. The attendant handed John his water and, noticing his cap, offered a quiet thank you for his service. John smiled, nodding, her kindness a small but welcome reminder that some people still valued his sacrifices. He took a sip of water, feeling a momentary surge of calm, but his gaze drifted to the in-flight magazine resting in the seat pocket in front of him. On impulse, he reached for it, flipping to the back where blank spaces for notes and crossword puzzles waited to be filled. Instead of solving puzzles, however, he found himself fishing for the pen he always kept in his shirt pocket. As he clicked it open, he stared down at the empty page, his heart heavy with words that had no easy place to go. Then, almost without thinking, he began to write. The words came slowly at first, each one considered, carefully placed. He didn't intend to complain or to accuse. Instead, he wanted to share a piece of himself, to bridge the chasm that lay between him and the woman who had so quickly dismissed him. This wasn't about proving her wrong but about showing her what lay beyond the worn cap and modest clothes. John wanted her to understand, if only for a moment, that he was more than a stranger in an upgraded seat. He started with his enlistment, describing the decision of an 18-year-old farm boy who had never left his hometown but felt compelled to serve. He wrote about the camaraderie, the brothers in arms he'd found, men from every corner of the country, bound together by shared purpose and sacrifice. He wrote about their laughter, their courage, and, though he didn't dwell on it, the sorrow of losing some of the best friends he'd ever known. As the memories poured out, John felt himself transported back to those distant days. His handwriting grew firmer as he shared pieces of the life he and his fellow soldiers had returned to, one where they hadn't always been welcomed or understood. And he wrote of Margaret, the woman who had been his rock, who had seen past the scars to the man underneath, who had loved him fully even as the world around them changed. His thoughts turned to his family, to his children and grandchildren. scattered across the country. They, too, had struggled to understand his past. The stories he rarely shared and the quiet pride he carried. They hadn't seen the fields of Europe. Didn't know the smell of smoke or the sound of explosions ringing in his ears at night. But they loved him. And he loved them. And somehow, despite the years and miles, that love had been enough. Finally, John turned his words to the present. He shared how her comments had stung. Not because of what she thought of him, but because of what they revealed about a world he had believed could be better. He expressed his sadness. Not with bitterness, but with the understanding that we all judge too quickly. That we often forget to see each other as people with lives and stories of our own. He ended his note with a message of hope. A gentle reminder that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to treat others with the respect they deserve. Setting down his pen, John looked over the letter. A sense of peace settling over him. Whether or not she read his words, whether or not they would have any effect. He had done something important. He had turned a painful experience into a chance to reach out. To build a bridge rather than deepen the divide. Taking a deep breath, he gently folded the note and tucked it into the magazine. With a nod to himself, he caught the eye of a passing flight attendant and gestured for her to come closer. "Would you mind giving this to the lady next to me when I go to the restroom?" he asked quietly. "It's just something I'd like her to read. No need to tell her it's from me." The attendant smiled, a hint of understanding in her eyes. "Of course, sir," she said, taking the folded page with care. With that, John excused himself and made his way down the aisle. His steps slow but steady, a feeling of lightness settling over him. In those few moments of putting pen to paper, he had found a way to transform hurt into hope, a gesture of goodwill offered in the face of misunderstanding. As he walked, he felt a quiet strength within him, a reminder that his journey wasn't over. He was no longer the young man who had once carried a rifle, but he was still, in his own way, a soldier of sorts, someone who believed in a better world. One conversation, one small act of kindness at a time. John returned to his seat, settling back and closing his eyes, pretending to doze. But in truth, his senses were heightened. Every breath and sound around him acutely felt. The folded note lay hidden in the in-flight magazine, a silent olive branch waiting to be discovered by the woman beside him. He had taken a risk, he knew that. His words held a piece of himself, vulnerable and exposed. Whether they would be received with the same openness he had written them was another matter entirely. Minutes passed, marked only by the gentle hum of the plane's engines and the quiet murmur of conversations around them. Then, the subtle rustle of paper broke through the background noise. John sensed her reach for the magazine, the soft crinkle as she turned the pages. He resisted the urge to open his eyes, to watch her reaction. Instead, he kept his breathing steady, focusing on the rhythm, as if it could calm his racing heart. At first, her posture remained rigid, her fingers taut around the page. She held the note carefully, almost warily, as though it might contain something she wasn't prepared to see. But as she began to read, her shoulders softened, her rigid stance easing. John could feel the atmosphere between them shift, almost as if the barrier she'd built around herself was slowly dissolving. A sudden intake of breath caught his attention, a small gasp followed by a quiet, barely audible sniffle. John felt a pang in his chest, not of satisfaction, but of empathy. The words he had written weren't meant to shame her, they were simply a reflection of his life, his journey, his pain and hope. And as he listened to her reaction, he knew that, perhaps for the first time, she was beginning to understand. Minutes drifted by, each one feeling like an eternity. He heard the paper being folded again, then the soft thud of her head falling back against the seat. A long, shaky sigh escaped her lips. A sound filled with something complex and heavy, regret, perhaps, or reflection. John's heart swelled with a strange, quiet hope. Finally, he couldn't resist any longer. He slowly opened his eyes, turning his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of her from the corner of his vision. She was gazing out the window, her face partially obscured, but he could see her reflection in the plexiglass. Tears glistened on her cheeks, and her carefully applied makeup was now slightly smudged. The sight struck him deeply, not because he took any satisfaction in her discomfort, but because he knew this was a moment of reckoning, a confrontation not with him, but with herself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence that had once been heavy with tension was now transformed, softened by a shared vulnerability. John waited, giving her space, allowing her to find her own path to the words he sensed were waiting within her. At last, she turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She met his gaze with an openness he hadn't seen before. Her earlier hostility replaced by a look of profound regret and something else. Understanding. "Mr. Edwards," she began. Her voice a whisper. Barely audible over the hum of the plane. She paused, swallowing as if to steady herself. I don't know what to say." Her voice trembled slightly, thick with emotion. "Your words, they've touched me deeply. I behaved terribly. And I'm truly sorry." John offered a small, gentle smile, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he replied softly, his voice filled with warmth. "I appreciate that." The woman took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage for something more. "Your letter, it brought back memories I thought I'd buried. My father," her voice cracked, and she glanced down at her hands, wringing them together nervously. "My father was a veteran, too. He served in Vietnam. But he never talked about it much. I just remember him sometimes, staring off, lost in memories none of us could understand." She spoke faster now, her words spilling out in a rush as if a dam had broken. "I was so angry at the world for what it took from him. For the parts of him that seemed to vanish after he came home. And when I saw you," she hesitated, her face flushing with a mix of shame and realization. "I don't know. I guess all those complicated feelings came rushing back. But that's no excuse. I judged you without knowing you. Without understanding the sacrifices you and so many others have made." John reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. His touch was light, a reassurance, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. "War leaves scars on everyone it touches," he said softly. "Not just on the soldiers, but on their families, too. I'm sorry for what you and your father went through." She nodded, blinking back tears as a fresh wave of emotion swept over her. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I'm the one who owes you an apology. My behavior, it dishonored my father's memory. He would have been ashamed of how I acted." John shook his head gently, his voice filled with kindness. "Perhaps," he said. "But I think he'd be proud of you now. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, to open ourselves up to new understanding." A hesitant smile broke across her face, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You're more generous than I deserve, Mr. Edwards. I don't know how to thank you." John's gaze softened, his expression filled with a wisdom born of years of life and experience. "It's not about deserving," he said. "It's about seeing the best in each other, even when it's hard. That's what I fought for all those years ago, not just freedom, but the chance to create a world where people can connect, grow, and learn from one another." She looked down, wiping the remaining tears from her cheeks, her face now filled with a new humility. "Your letter said it's never too late to learn and grow," she murmured. "I think I understand that now. Thanks to you." The plane continued its steady course, a quiet moment stretching between them, filled not with the silence of strangers but with the comfortable pause between two people who had found a connection beyond words. They continued to talk, her voice softening as she shared memories of her father, the good times, the difficult ones, the legacy he had left behind. John listened attentively, occasionally sharing his own experiences, finding common ground in their shared connection to the military, their mutual understanding of the scars it left on the people they loved. As the plane began its descent, John felt a sense of peace wash over him, a feeling of closure that had eluded him for years. He had come on this journey to honor the past, but in doing so, he had helped bridge a gap to the future, a small but meaningful step toward the world he had always believed in, a world of kindness, respect, and understanding. They disembarked together, the tension of their initial encounter now replaced with something far deeper. At the gate, the woman turned to John one last time, her expression one of genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Not just for your service, but for your kindness. You've given me a lesson I won't soon forget." John smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you for being open to it," he replied gently. "Remember, every day is a chance to make a difference, to bridge the divides between us. That's the real victory, not what happens on battlefields, but what we do in our everyday lives to make the world a little bit better." As she walked away, her head held high but with a new humility in her step, John felt a profound sense of peace. This journey, which had begun with memories of the past, had become something else entirely, a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there was room for compassion, for connection. With a contented sigh, John adjusted his cap and made his way to the exit, his heart lighter despite the weight of his years. He had come here to honor his past, but in a way, he had helped shape a small piece of the future. And as he stepped out into the sunlight, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought and a victory well earned, not on foreign soil, but in the equally important realm of the human heart. As John walked through the bustling terminal, the hum of activity around him faded into a background blur. His mind was still back on the plane, lingering over the unexpected connection he'd forged. The encounter had been both a confrontation and a healing moment, a journey of understanding that he hadn't expected but now treasured deeply. His heart felt lighter. Yet a quiet, contemplative weight remained as he mulled over the morning's events. Passengers moved around him in a hurry, brushing past with their bags and boarding passes, each lost in their own world. But for John, the airport seemed suspended in a moment of stillness, as if the usual rush of travelers was somehow softened by the impact of the conversation he had just had. He wondered if the woman, still a stranger in so many ways, was feeling the same weight of change. If she, too, was reflecting on the words they'd exchanged. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the young man in uniform approaching him until he felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. John turned, meeting the earnest gaze of a soldier, barely out of his teens. The young man's eyes held a mixture of respect and awe, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Excuse me, sir," he began, his voice shy but steady. "I just wanted to thank you. I saw what happened on the plane. I couldn't hear everything. But, well, I could tell you handled it with a lot of grace. It meant a lot to me, seeing that." John felt a warmth blossom in his chest, a quiet pride that caught him off guard. He offered the young man a nod and a soft smile. "Thank you, son," he replied, his voice steady, though emotion colored his words. "I appreciate that. And thank you for your service." The young soldier's face brightened with a mix of gratitude and admiration. "People don't always understand what service really means," he said, glancing down, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes, even my own family struggles with it." He looked up at John, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "But seeing how you handled yourself, it reminded me of why I do this." John reached out, patting the soldier on the shoulder. "Sometimes, it's not about making people understand," he said. "It's about doing what's right, standing up for what matters, even when it's not easy." The young man nodded, a look of understanding settling over him. After a moment, he gave John a small salute and continued on his way, disappearing into the crowd. John watched him go, a renewed sense of purpose filling his heart. He had thought his days of service were over, that his contributions had come to a quiet close. But now, he saw that the impact of his actions had rippled out in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he continued toward the baggage claim, John noticed other glances, passengers who had been on the same flight, who had witnessed the confrontation and its resolution. Some offered nods of acknowledgement, others met his gaze with thoughtful expressions, their eyes holding a quiet respect. John felt a profound sense of humility wash over him. This was not a battle fought with weapons or on foreign soil. Yet it had required courage all the same, a courage born of vulnerability and a willingness to extend kindness. Finally, as he reached the carousel, John spotted the familiar face of the flight attendant who had first intervened. She walked up to him, her expression warm but touched with something more, a reflective sadness mixed with gratitude. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice soft, "I just wanted to say, thank you. I didn't mean to intrude. But I saw what you wrote, and I saw the way you handled everything." She hesitated, her eyes filling with admiration. "It's not every day that we witness such patience and grace. It's a reminder we all need, I think." John met her gaze, his own eyes softening. "Sometimes, it takes more strength to be kind than it does to fight," he replied. "We can choose how we respond, even when it's hard. And maybe, in those moments, we can help others see a little differently, too." She smiled, visibly moved. "Well, you've certainly helped me see things differently. And I think you left a mark on more than a few people on that flight today." With a quiet nod, John turned back to the carousel, spotting his well-worn suitcase moving slowly toward him. He lifted it, feeling the familiar weight of its contents, Margaret's photo, his uniform, the memories he carried with him always. He adjusted his cap, feeling a renewed sense of pride, not just in the life he had lived, but in the choice he had made to extend understanding where others might have turned away. As he stepped out into the bright sunlight beyond the terminal doors, John took a deep breath, letting the warmth fill his lungs. This journey, which had started as a solitary tribute to his past, had become something far more. In choosing compassion, he had found a way to honor his fallen friends, to live the ideals he had fought for so many years ago. The day was quiet, the world moving on as it always did. But John walked forward, feeling lighter, his heart filled with a deep and abiding peace. He had done what he could, Extended kindness even when it wasn't easy. And in doing so, he had found a new purpose. The journey, he realized, wasn't just about honoring the past but about leaving a legacy in the here and now, one built on respect, understanding, and a bridge to the future. And as he continued on, surrounded by the bright and busy world, he knew that his service wasn't over. He still had so much left to give, one conversation, one gentle act at a time. The familiar stretch of road leading to John's small, weathered house unfurled before him, framed by tall trees whose branches swayed gently in the late afternoon breeze. After the long hours of his journey, the sight of his home brought a quiet comfort, a reminder of the simple life he had cherished for so many years. The wooden fence, the porch steps softened by time and use, each detail held memories of his life with Margaret, of raising their children, of a past woven into the very fabric of this place. John parked his old pickup in the gravel driveway, taking a moment to sit in the stillness. The events of the trip replayed in his mind, moments shifting like scenes from a film, the woman's sharp words, his own restrained hurt, and, most vividly, the transformation that had occurred when they both let down their guard. What had begun as a painful encounter had blossomed into an unexpected connection, one that still reverberated through him. As he climbed out of the truck, his eyes fell on the single rose bush by the porch, blooming in full despite the season's fading warmth. Margaret had planted it years ago, a stubborn flower that seemed to defy the odds, surviving every winter, every storm, with a tenacity that reminded him of her. He reached down to touch one of the soft petals, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as memories of her laughter filled his mind. Inside, the house was cool and quiet, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet grounding him as he moved through each room, reconnecting with the life he had temporarily left behind. His suitcase thudded softly as he placed it on the bed, and he slowly unpacked, taking extra care with the photograph of Margaret that he'd brought with him, his fingertips brushing her smiling face. She had always known how to calm him, how to remind him of his strength, and he could almost hear her voice now, steady and reassuring, urging him forward. After unpacking, he poured himself a cup of coffee, settling into his favorite armchair by the window. The light was fading, casting a warm glow over the familiar fields beyond, their wide, open spaces comforting in their simplicity. Sipping his coffee, he let his mind wander, reflecting on the moments that had brought him here, to this quiet revelation. The letter he'd written to the woman on the plane had started as a small gesture, a way to cope with the hurt of being judged. But in offering a piece of himself, he had unknowingly extended a lifeline, an invitation for her to see beyond the surface, to reach for something greater than her own assumptions. And in the end, she had responded with vulnerability and grace, a reminder that even the most hardened hearts could be softened by empathy. As he gazed out at the horizon, a deep sense of purpose swelled within him. Perhaps he had come to the tribute to honor the friends he had lost, to pay his respects. But he realized now that his journey wasn't just about remembering, it was about living. He still had a role to play, a legacy to leave. Not just in the quiet acts of kindness he offered strangers but in the example he set for his family, his community, and even strangers he encountered on flights and in passing moments. The sound of tires on gravel broke his thoughts, and he glanced out the window to see his daughter's car pulling into the driveway. A warm smile spread across his face as she stepped out, her familiar form stirring memories of all the times they'd shared over the years. She waved, catching sight of him through the window, her own face lighting up with a mix of surprise and joy at finding him already home. "Dad," she called as she opened the door, her voice echoing through the quiet house. She stepped inside, wrapping him in a hug that spoke of years of love and connection. "How was the trip?" John settled back into his chair, gesturing for her to sit. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, wondering how much he should share. But as he looked into her expectant eyes, he realized that this was part of his purpose too, passing down the stories that mattered, offering her a glimpse of the journey he had been on, the lessons he had learned along the way. "It was more than I expected," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful. He recounted the tribute, the memories of old friends, the feeling of being honored but also reminded of the past. And then, after a pause, he told her about the woman on the plane, the confrontation, and the letter he had written, his words unfolding like pages in a storybook. His daughter listened intently, her eyes widening with each detail, her expression shifting from disbelief to admiration to understanding. When he finished, she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "That's incredible. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. But you turned it into something beautiful. You always find a way to see the good in people. John chuckled softly, shaking his head. Sometimes it takes more effort than I'd like to admit, he replied, his eyes twinkling. But I figure, if we don't at least try, what's the point of everything we've lived through? She nodded, a thoughtful look crossing her face. I think you showed her something she needed to see. And who knows? Maybe she'll carry that forward in her own life. And it'll make a difference for someone else down the line. They sat in silence, both reflecting on the power of small actions, on the ripple effect that even a single act of understanding could have. As the evening shadows grew longer, John felt a warmth settle over him. A quiet contentment that came not from accolades or recognition, but from knowing he had done something meaningful, something lasting. When his daughter finally stood to leave, she hugged him tightly once more. A silent promise to carry his story with her, to keep alive the lessons he had shared. As she drove away, John watched her taillights disappear down the road, a sense of peace settling over him. Returning to his chair by the window, he gazed out at the darkening sky, the stars beginning to dot the heavens above. He thought of his friends, the ones he had lost, the ones who would never come home. This quiet act of kindness, this moment of understanding, these were the things he had fought for, the world he had hoped to build with his service. As he sat in the gentle glow of the evening, John felt a sense of closure. His life had been long and rich, filled with moments of hardship and joy, of love and loss. But through it all, he had held on to the belief that people, when given the chance, could change, could grow, could learn to see each other for who they truly were. And as he closed his eyes, the soft sounds of the night filling the room, he knew that his journey wasn't quite over. There would be more days, more conversations, more bridges to build. And with every opportunity, he would continue to serve, not on the battlefields of war, but in the quiet spaces of the heart, where understanding and compassion could flourish. In the silence of his home, surrounded by memories and the life he had built, John felt an abiding peace. He had honored the past, and he had helped shape the future, one small act of kindness at a time. And that, he realized, was a legacy worth leaving. In the days that followed his journey home, John's life resumed its quiet rhythm. His mornings were filled with the gentle hum of routine, coffee brewing on the stove, the morning paper folded neatly by his favorite armchair, and the familiar creak of floorboards beneath his feet as he moved through his house. Outside, the leaves had started to turn, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Autumn was settling over the town, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. Yet something within John felt different. The events of the flight lingered with him, not as a painful memory but as a quiet affirmation that even the smallest gestures of understanding could create ripples far beyond their origin. His words, his willingness to reach across a divide, had turned a moment of judgment into a bridge of empathy. And though he would never fully know the impact of that encounter, he felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that he had tried. One afternoon, as he was tending to the rose bush by the porch, a car pulled into the driveway. John looked up, shading his eyes from the sun, as his daughter stepped out, waving as she approached. But this time, she wasn't alone. A young boy trailed behind her, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers in his small hands, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Dad," his daughter greeted him with a smile. "I have someone here who's been wanting to meet you." John wiped his hands on his jeans, his gaze shifting to the boy, who was looking up at him with a mixture of awe and shyness. The boy stepped forward, his tiny hand reaching out with the bouquet, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mom told me you're a hero," he said, his eyes bright with wonder. "She said you helped her on the plane. I wanted to say thank you." For a moment, John was taken aback, the boy's words settling into his heart with a gentle weight. He looked over at his daughter, who was watching him with a knowing smile, her eyes brimming with pride. She nodded, encouraging him to accept the flowers. And John felt a surge of warmth as he took the bouquet from the boy's hands. "What's your name, son?" John asked gently, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "Henry," the boy replied, his voice stronger now. "My mom said you're very brave. Like a superhero. She said I should be brave too. Like you." John's heart swelled, and he placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Henry, being brave doesn't mean you have to be a superhero," he said, his voice kind and reassuring. "Sometimes, being brave just means being kind, even when it's hard. Can you remember that?" Henry nodded, his eyes shining with admiration. "Yes, sir. I'll remember." As the boy stepped back, his daughter reached out, squeezing John's hand. "You've made more of an impact than you know, Dad," she murmured. "I've heard her tell the story to anyone who'll listen, How that flight changed her. How your kindness opened her eyes. She said it made her realize how important it is to teach her own son to be better. John felt a gentle pride settle over him. Not the pride of medals or accolades, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had planted a seed of change. He had reached one person. And that person would carry his message forward. Teaching it to her son. Passing it down through her family. The ripple of his actions would continue. Expanding quietly. Touching lives he would never meet. After his daughter and Henry left, John returned to his porch. The bouquet resting in his lap as he gazed out at the autumn fields. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden light across the landscape. And he felt a deep peace settle over him. His life, filled with memories of love, loss, and the unbreakable bond of friendship, had been a good one. He had honored his past, carried forward the legacy of his comrades, and left a mark on the world. Not in grand gestures but in simple acts of compassion. As the evening shadows grew longer, John reached for the bouquet, his hands brushing over the delicate petals. He thought of Margaret, of how she had always reminded him of the importance of kindness, of seeing the best in others, and he knew that she would have been proud of him. Not for the battles he had fought but for the peace he had helped create. That night, as he prepared for bed, John took a moment to look at the photograph of Margaret on his nightstand. Her familiar smile a comforting presence. He felt as though he could still hear her voice, gentle and wise, guiding him forward, reminding him that every small act of goodness counted, that every bridge he built made the world a little brighter. Lying down, he closed his eyes, feeling the soft pull of sleep wash over him. His journey had been long, filled with trials and triumphs. Yet he felt lighter now, as though a burden had been lifted. The legacy he had built, he realized, wasn't just in his service but in the way he had lived. The choices he had made to reach across divides, to offer kindness where it was least expected. As he drifted off, a faint smile played across his lips. His life had come full circle, and he knew, with a gentle certainty, that he had left behind something of value, a legacy of compassion, of understanding, of the quiet, enduring power of kindness. And in that final, peaceful moment, John Edwards, veteran, husband, father, and unexpected teacher, let himself rest, content in the knowledge that he had, in his own quiet way, changed the world.